Baruch. Kia ora tātou, ko Sophia Beaton tōku ingoa, motipohui te mauka, oriti te awa, te rau aroha te marae, kaitahu me ka te mamoi ahau. Kia ora everyone, I am Sophia and I'm kaitahu from Bluff originally. I'm part of the TSI team and part of nested inside of there, the Tamariki Wellbeing team, and really looking forward to being with you all today. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, ko Debble Goodwin tōku ingoa. Ki te taha o tōku pāpā, ko taiare he te manga, ko o hene mate roa te awa, ko te rewerewa te marae, ko te māhuruhure te hapu, ko tūkoi te iwi. Ki te taha o tōku kuia, ko hiwarau te maunga, ko ohiwa te moana, ko roimata te marae, ko upoko rehe te hapu, ko whakatohea te iwi. Ki te taha o tōku māma no Ngāti Pākehā. I'm originally from a little town called Aotearoa, where I grew up, and have lived and worked in Hamilton, Aotearoa for basically most of my working and study life. Student life and raised my family there. I work as a developmental evaluator along with a team of colleagues around the motu, and we do mahi, a lot of mahi with government agencies, particularly like Oranga Tamariki. I see Mātis on there, hi Māori, and lots of agencies who are often co-designing these days. So very interested in sharing kōrero around our mahi, as well as the work that I've been doing with my PhD around co-design and evaluating co-design from a kaupapa Māori perspective. So yeah, lovely to see you all.
Kia ora, Debbie and Sophia. Thank you, and thanks Baruch for landing us into today. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Lovely to see everybody again on our not quite nearly last conversation. Not that this will be our last conversation, but really awesome to be landing here in our kind of third week together over a couple of months now. But beautiful to see everybody again. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to. Do I need slides? Let me see. Okay, maybe I'll put some slides in. I'll just land us into today, and you will get to hear more. Sophia and Debbie are helping us with this conversation that we're going to unpack a bit today around building learning capacity or growing our learning infrastructure as part of the work of systems change and innovation and design and equity. So really pleased to have Sophia and Debbie also tomorrow to just help us kind of unpack this conversation a bit together. So welcome, korua, lovely to have you. So just, yeah, we're at our third module, and we'll be closing off the kind of core set of the program tomorrow, and then and Baruch is also going to talk to us tomorrow about some of the ongoing conversations that we'll be holding space if people want to return and continue to unpack. So there will be opportunities throughout the rest of the year to do that if people want to, but really privileged to be landing on this final module with you all today. Just to check in, as we always do, wanting to start off with just seeing how everybody is going and where everybody is, how everyone's feeling and landing for the day. So as we have done every other session, please just take a moment to connect in with where you're at and think about how your waka is today. Kia o waka and INA, how is your waka today? So a Slido link should be popping up in the chat, and we can just have a moment to connect in with how everyone's traveling on this Thursday. There's some new words in there this week as well. People are kind of really either in different spaces or finding different ways to think about where they're sitting. Awesome. Particularly like the KFC zinger. I've never had one of those, but I imagine that's a positive thing. Awesome. Some people feeling overloaded, hitting strong winds. Some really only just holding in there. So hopefully we can carry you along a little bit this morning and tomorrow. And then some other people who are in a kind of really moving forward and energized space. So it's probably a good balance there across the Ropu. So awesome. Thank you, everybody. Really nice just to know how everyone's doing and see how everyone's finding their spaces of language around where you are. So knowing and unlearning, unknowing and unlearning, sorry. Intifying, challenging and optimistic. Awesome. So ka pai, kia ora, thank you. Last week and then into today, and then we're gonna have the privilege of also hearing from a couple of the teams again this week as we did last time. So last week we, or 2 weeks ago, we had Roy Mata and Desna Whanga Sholem with us, sharing some of their different contexts and different journeys, but around transformative practices and working with people in place that were focusing on shifting and building capacities, as well as kind of traversing through spaces in ways that engaged with the histories and what was sitting there, but also creating healing spaces and working in ways that were grounding into people in place. So they both gave us some different dimensions and languages around transformative practices. We provided a sort of government perspective on what we might be thinking about when we're thinking about shifting from transactional to transformational, and these moves to kind of different ways of working and being, and that design processes can help us actually start to build capacities and think more in ways about ecosystems and how we platform for community participation or for collaboration. So shifting away from those more transactional models and starting to develop our capacities for working and these other more collective ways. And we also talked about how we work producing outcomes in and of itself, and being a way of starting to shift how the connections of systems or mindsets and capabilities, and that those are the that provides us with a different way of thinking about scaling, rather than always thinking about the product at the end being the thing that will create change or the thing that we're trying to replicate. So how the way in which we work actually being a really powerful part of moving and shifting for change. Just some of the things that people brought forward when they were sharing their reflections and responses to some of the questions that we worked through as a group last week. So I'm just pulling out a couple of the things that represent some of the themes as well. Was that thing of acknowledging where we're starting from, and that actually start points aren't neutral and needing to engage with what's happened in the past, positive and negative, and that if we work without in a way that ignores historical context, we're actually perpetuating inequity. But that's a challenge to take on, that recognition of the power of understanding what we're working in and what the context is, but that the lens of past, present and future is both an acknowledging lens and a healing lens, as well as an aspirational and empowering way to think about the opportunities that we have and the capacities that we're also building on. People talked it's a really nice language about thinking intergenerationally, like a Cody tree, but also people acknowledging their own context, set them up as problem solvers. You're coming in to solve problems. That's what we're trained to do, is identify problems, and how that in itself can potentially be a framing that's not helpful, or that we need to be a bit critical or have a critical lens on the balance of keeping on moving, but thinking wide for systems and the kind of, I guess, the muscles that we need to be able to hold both those, but not getting caught in the wide so that we're not moving forward. Someone talked about the potential when in complexity and when there is the histories that we're dealing with, starting with understanding what shared values are is a really powerful place to start. So you're not focused straight away on the what, but you're talking more about how do we want to work together, and that can help unpack some of those things. And people were also leaning into this idea around scaling practices, not just the things that we sort of make, and what the idea of localized evidence might mean as a way to actually connect into context and what's going on for people. And for example, Whānau's definition of what wellbeing is, as opposed to our potentially external perspective on that. And we're going to look more at some of those things in the next day and tomorrow as well, as part of looking at the learning capability and practice. So those were just some of the things that came forward from the conversations that you had, and we've got a bigger synthesis that we can share back for people. What I wanted to do now is just invite, if that was sort of our perspective on what we'd traveled on, we wanted to invite two of the teams to share a little bit like we did last week, introduce us to yourselves and your world and just how the conversations we're having here connects into your work. So it'd be great to hear from Tavis and then from Shaquille about the different contexts that you're in and some of the things that are coming up for you as a result of the conversations we're having here or some of the things that are going on in your world. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing and invite Tavis, if that's okay, to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about the context that you're working in and the connection to these conversations. Kia ora.
Kia ora Evan, ko Tavis toku ingoa no te tai rāwhiti ahau, ko Ngāti Rangi te hapu, ko Hiki Rangi te maunga, ko Waiapu te awa, ko Ngāti Parau te iwi. It's funny that you put me and Shaq together because we just discovered in the first meeting, we looked at some of the details on the medal board and our great-grandfathers were raised as brothers together. We wondered if there was a connection. Cool. Yeah. So we're both from the coast, which is really nice. Tuatai he mihi nunui kia koutou ki ngā facilitators, kia koe pini, Baruch. Thank you for all of your work with this. It's really, those of us that have sort of facilitated via Zoom in the past, it's really tricky, and this just is, the mechanics of this in itself is just such a great lesson in facilitation. And we're aside from the content itself, where our group were just talking about how much we've learned from that. So thank you very much. The course itself, I wouldn't say it's providing a set of answers for us to sort of lift and shift to the work that we're doing. We work in internal affairs, and a lot of our work is, well, very transactional. So lots of small sort of interactions with individual customers. But it's given us pause for thought, lots and lots of questions. And that's really good. So the course is the beginning of some really tricky conversations for us. And so across the last 5 weeks, we've been spending lots of time thinking about how we work and the goals of the work we do. One of the really important discussions we've been having is around that question you asked the other week about, is our organization a good treaty partner? And then what does that mean to be a good treaty partner? You know, we've got all the bits and pieces, and we've got a lot of the language going around the organization, but is it actually effective? So that's not a simple conversation to have. The irony for us is that Internal Affairs holds the treaty itself in one of our buildings in Wellington. And I think that question is especially thorny for kaimahi Māori who work in government. So there's all sorts of layers, and that's not to criticize you know, the action of any individuals within our organization. That's not to say individuals are necessarily bad treaty partners, but the organization itself, how is that performing? So we had some pretty strong opinions about that. Yeah, so recognizing the difference between the actions of individuals and the broader organization, and thinking about how our own spheres of influence, whatever size they are, can be used to nudge the organization in the right direction. The big takeaways for us three who are in the same team, we're talking about holding complexity, you know, being aware of it, but not being overwhelmed or helpless, acknowledging it, avoiding the busyness and hastiness, which often comes with sort of working on discrete pieces of work, and the importance of spending that time and Te Rapunga. We don't always have the ability to dwell there, but that comes with organizational maturity. And so that's one of the big things that I'm really looking forward to doing, assuming this course is running again, is to promote this course to the people sort of higher up in the organization, because this sort of stuff is about organizational transformation, and that needs to happen at all the levels, not just at sort of the coalface of the work we do. And another thing is about the quite a simple thing is the capability mapping exercises that were included in the the pre-work, that's really useful, and we're going to use that in our smaller team in the next couple of weeks to take stock of the skills and knowledge in the team, and then that sort of points us in the direction of further development.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Tavis. Really appreciate you just giving us that really connected reflection, but also raising like the complexity that people are working in, the multiplicity of that complexity, particularly if you're holding multiple roles and you have different potai on inside organizations, which as non-Māori, I don't have to experience that duplicity, duality and those complexities. So I appreciate you bringing into the scope those realities for the navigation that different people are doing inside organizations whilst also doing the mahi at the same time. So thank you so much for sharing your reflections, and as with other teams, just being kind of giving us that the honest interpretation of the work and the interfaces with these conversations and the work. So I really appreciate every time someone from the Ropu comes in and connects into the world for us and our experiences, that it's helpful for others too, to just hear how these things are coming up, and oftentimes to know that other people are having similar conversations and unpacking similar things and being a connect around that. So just again, thank you so much for that. Awesome. And awesome to have had you make that connection with Shaquille, who's now going to also share his kōrero. So thank you again. Kia ora, and I'll hand over to you, Shaq.
Kia ora tātou. Tūtahi tēnei te mihi kia koutou i ngā kai whakawā. Ko whakarite i nei rauimi mō mātou. Ko tira kia tātou i hikama, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Ko Shaq meuna tōku ingoa, ko te tāo tōku pāpa, no kuki airini, no rarotonga, no mauke, ngā mautere, tāo tōku māma, no Ngāti Porou, no Tuauau, te marae, ko Ngāti Rangi, te hapu. So kia ora tātou. So yeah, Shaq, whanaunga of Tavis, which was pretty cool. Kicking it off, I guess it was the first session, came across the same last name, and it isn't a last name that is quite used around our land here, but it's really awesome to connect with whānau in different agencies, and also being able to connect with a lot of others in our breakout sessions as well, and sharing whakaaro of what works, what doesn't work, and how everyone else operates. So for myself, New Zealand Police, I have a different lens as well, because I predominantly work in a space that is Māori Pacific Ethnic Services. So essentially that is my role, being able to have that Māori, that cultural lens on different approaches and different tasks that the business would be looking into. But when asked, like, what are we doing to apply, having to actually reflect is probably the major one. Because we all work in such a fast-paced environment, and with the police and all of the mahi or the take that is happening recently around our country, is everything's been moving so quickly that we don't actually have time to reflect. And I guess coming off the back of the long weekend as well, just reflecting on my own self-wellbeing, being able to head home to the East Coast as well, and be surrounded by my people, my whānau, was a great time, I guess, leading into this, into how I can reflect on what works for me, and my values and where I stand in this world and in this organization as well. So moving, I guess, from that transaction to transformation, I actually heard a little gold nugget yesterday in a hui, where they talk about we need to move from ecosystems to ecosystems. And a lot of our mahi here in New Zealand Police it is intergenerational trauma that is still being driven into our people today. And it is really the ecosystem that needs to be pushed out into being able to create a better ecosystem. And it's really the unweaving of that trauma, but being able to acknowledge the trauma and move forward from a place of hurt to a place of where we can prosper in every aspect. And when we do touch about well-being, it's not just the well-being of yourself, but the well-being of those around you. And my value of well-being can also differ to the well-being of someone else. So it isn't a framework that we should be sort of going by. It is self-determinated, and yeah, it is really a space where I guess we are fortunate that today, I guess coming off of lockdown last year, where there has been a big push to self-identify and reflect on how we are in the public eye. But yeah, especially I guess again moving forward again, there's being in the space of Māori Pacific ethnic service, I feel like I am a little crumb in my space trying to make a difference. But if I turn to the analogy of the boy throwing along the beach, grabbing up a shell, throwing that into the water, his father comes along and says, "Why are you doing that? Look how many shells, there's thousands of shells on this beach here. What are you trying to do?" Yes, I'm trying to make a difference. How are you going to make a difference? Throw one more shell into the water. Guess what? I made a difference to that one. And that's all we've got to keep doing, is just keep trying to make a difference to one piece of shell at a time. And then eventually it will accumulate into a big, more positive change. And again, the question of are we a good treaty partner? It is an ironic question for New Zealand Police as well. We do have really strong relationships with iwi in what we do. Take Te Paioranga, for example, the alternative resolutions, where it has now been passed over to iwi, who run those iwi boards on their marae for the people with the lesser crimes. So we do have those partnerships, but how are we seen in the public eye and as a whole organisation is, I guess, still on the balance. Excuse the bit touchy cookery at the moment, but yeah, it is a really I guess battling issue that we're having to face daily. And what kind of sphere of influence do we have, but also what kind of sphere of influence do I have in my space when I'm coming here because I want to expand my knowledge, expand my kete, and people are turning to me for guidance. However, if I don't take that time to reflect on myself, I don't see the cracks or the holes in my kete where everything is just slipping out. And then so it has been a real good learning for myself, and seeing how we as a organisation can work from the inside out and from the top down, bottom up, from every angle, and try and overcome that up-down hierarchy approach, and then try and look as, instead of going up and down, we're going sideways. So yeah, it's been a real awesome opportunity, and tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Nō reira, tēnā la tātou katoa.
Kia ora, kia ora. Thank you so much, both of you. Again, just lots of richness, even just in a few minutes there, of kind of mapping your personal journeys as well as organisational journeys, as well as our journey collectively here in Aotearoa. So thank you again, both of you, for offering that whakaaro and kōrero into this space this morning. Beautiful, the imagery of the shells and the ripples in the water. So again, just really thank you both for what you've shared there, and just hoping that when you are having those conversations with each other, there is that opportunity for connecting and sharing and that kind of collective learning that I know is possible across this rōpū, because there's so many different perspectives and experiences, and people are in different places. So just hoping that those spaces are being places to be able to share that, and that we can keep doing that today and tomorrow. So again, kia ora, thank you so much, both of you, for that. And I think Colleen will be sharing some of her whakaaro tomorrow morning as well. So we'll have that insight too from another perspective. So just now to go into that space where you can chat with each other a little bit too. And if you want to pick up on some of the things that have just been shared here, then totally just take the conversation where you want to. But the other invitation, which is sort of layered into some of the things that have just been shared here, is around the idea of evidence and the kind of evidence that we use, and the way learning is showing up in our organizations at the moment. So I'm not going to, I won't go back into the slides. I'll just talk to the invitation for your connection. So in a minute, Baruch will put us into the breakout group so that you can connect. You may end up with people that you've already met. I imagine there's some overlaps now, but if there are new people, please take the time to introduce yourselves. And the invitation is just over the last couple of weeks, and through some of the prompting materials that we sent, was this question around what counts as evidence, and who gets to decide what evidence is, and the different perspectives that need to be present for us to make good decisions, and knowing that evidence is often a really loaded term, and that it has a particular set of kind of power constructs associated with it, particularly in government, about what constitutes evidence. So we've asked people to unpack that a bit, and just think about, what is our relationship to evidence? How do we use that term and that word in our organizations at the moment? When someone says they're evidence-based, is there a default thing that they're thinking about? And also the practice of learning and reflection, which was talked about already this morning. How is space made for that now? And I know that in different teams and different organizations, that learning practice is developed in different ways. So there may be things that people are doing that you can share with each other. So we'll just take 10, 12 minutes maybe just to check in, say hi. And if you want to have a conversation about either of those two things, how evidence kind of shows up, or what learning practices are happening, then that would be awesome. And we'll see you back here in 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Kia ora. Cool. I think we probably specialize in raising questions, not answering questions. So there'll be more of that. If people want to drop any thoughts in, feel free to continue to do that about the things that are showing up. And what I want to do now is just give a little bit of a map for the conversation for today and tomorrow, and then just lay out some of the sort of some of the key thoughts to sit with that then Sophia and Debbie will help us explore a little bit more too, from their own perspectives and then in their own context and worlds. Whoops, I've lost the mouse. Okay, cool. So just firstly, I'll just tap into a couple of different concepts that we have talked about, but just highlight some things to kind of sit in the background. Sophia's going to share with us some of the mahi that she's doing in Tamariki Wellbeing, and what it means for them to be embedding learning and looking at outcomes within the context of trying to shift systems as well as work with whānau, and the big and little kind of setting. As a group, we'll come back to that question of what it means for the learning culture that exists and how we build that within our organisations. And we'll close today with a reflection and kōrero from Debbie around some of the mahi that she's doing, and then we'll return to that tomorrow to hear some more of her work that has come from lots of different places, but in particular just to mahi to Debbie, who just submitted her PhD 2 weeks ago, alongside many other amazing efforts that she has done. But so just to acknowledge that awesome effort, and that she's sharing with us whakaaro that's from her work, and that's been pulled together over a range of things. And I know different people have been involved in different ways. So really exciting that we can celebrate that with her, and just exploring together this idea of what matters to track, and then what's emerging, what comes next from our time together. So that's sort of the map for the next 2 days. So I just want to, before handing over to Sophia, just talk through I just sort of introduce a couple of things, a couple of ideas to sit in the background, some of which that we've already traversed a bit together. Firstly, this idea of localizing the evidence, and just unpack a little bit how we talk about that in some ways, the idea of tracking systems changes as well as other kind of outcomes, and then this role of learning. So just highlighting that as a capacity that we need to build is critical to supporting change and the kind of shifts we're working towards within the public sector when we think about equity and intergenerational wellbeing. So firstly, we did send some prompts, and people have been having these conversations. We can see some of the reflections in the chat now about the term evidence and what it's synonymous for, and how it gets used. And so often the idea of evidence actually represents a particular paradigm or dominant idea around evidence that comes from a Western context. It's often around quantitative data. There's particular kinds of bias around what people consider to be strong evidence that actually needs a really critical lens applied to it. So unpacking our ideas of evidence and who gets to decide and constitute what good evidence is a really core part of unpacking some of the existing power structures that play out particularly in government contexts, and the idea of evidence-based. And one of the reasons why we think it's really important to challenge that, apart from understanding the diversity of perspectives and where evidence can come from and how different evidence is formed, is also that if we're working in a space where we're trying to learn how to work differently or do different things, then we can't rely on existing evidence to tell us how that's going to happen. We have to be developing new evidence, often drawing on different types of knowledge systems or bringing different knowledge systems together and developing and understanding together, as opposed to relying on existing demonstrated outcomes that may have worked under a particular set of conditions or come from a different place. It's not a context of dragging and dropping specific interventions. We need to understand in the context of Aotearoa and from different perspectives actually what works here, and build an evidence-informed way of working. So just wanting to kind of set the context what evidence means or the kinds of evidence that might be useful to us when we're actually trying to change the way we work. So we've talked about localizing evidence, and I just want to give an example of what that might look like in a design process, or how different forms of evidence might show up. So this is not in any particular order, but the idea of how you might draw on multiple forms of knowing. And it might be a process like someone had made the comment in one of the sessions, how do we know what whānau define or rangatahi define as well-being? How do we know what that looks like in their world? And so you might start with some existing concepts about protective factors and well-being, and things that we know at a high level are really helpful and important to enhancing well-being. But actually we need to localize what that looks like in context, possibly challenge it, and work with whānau and rangatahi to understand, well, how does this idea of well-being show up in your world? What does it mean? It's going to be very different for young people in Westport versus young people in South Auckland. Let's talk about actually how it shows up, but also the potential to understand well-being through Indigenous knowledge, through Indigenous lenses, and understand it's not necessarily going to be written in the same formats as it's not all going to be in existing literature. How do you surface the knowledge that already exists about well-being that is culturally grounded and contextual, also different in different places? And then how do you work to understand how to activate those things on the ground? And through a process like that, we end up generating new culturally grounded, whānau-centric ways of knowing and doing. So you're drawing on different forms of evidence, but then you're actually producing your knowing about what works in place, or allowing that to happen. And we could talk about that as practice-based evidence. So you're developing through making and learning together. This is just an example of localized indicators. So where the Tamariki Wellbeing team, so Angie talked a little bit about this, where the tikanga framework that they use is both their way of working and the kind of outcomes they're trying to amplify and enhance. So what does whanaungatanga look like for some whānau? It looks like knowing more people in their street. What mana might look like is that the kids are in kapahaka, where we're engaged in our local practices, cultural practices with our whānau. Manaakitanga might mean in a in a systems context, so coming back to how the system's changing to reflect more of these values, staff know that they can give what's needed, or engaging with whānau as whānau, not just recipients of services. So these are examples of where there's concepts that have been used for indicators or outcomes, but then teams have looked at, well, in this particular setting of a library or an MSD office, how does this play out? What does it actually look like to manaki or to be manaki? What does it look like for whānau to feel like they're able to lead on something? So these are just examples of what it might mean to localize. And you could look at that in lots of different ways. So that's sort of a little exploration, and Sophia will give some concrete examples, but of this idea of localizing evidence and how that might show up. The second one was tracking systems outcomes. So we did start to touch on this last week. How do you look at not just what's changing for whānau, because we have a real propensity in government to think when we do the work, what we're going to do is shift and change things for whānau or in community, and we don't look so much at actually what's required of us to set the conditions for well-being, and how are we working in a way that ensures effort by and in community and whānau is actually set up for success. Are we creating the conditions that actually enable people to do what they want to be able to do? So shifting the system settings and conditions is just as critical, if not more critical. And so ways to look for different shifts in the system. And one of the useful tools that a lot of people have found helpful in this context is the 6 conditions of systems change. So there's a link to the paper that this comes from at the end of the slides, but just naming the types of things that you might observe when you see shifts in systems, and you can see these match a little bit to some of the localized indicators I gave before. Yes, we want to see policy shifts, but we also need to see different kinds of relationships and connections, shifts in power, and most critically mental models. So people shifting from their idea of thinking, say, from clients to whānau, those things where you actually reflect your ways of thinking and seeing about how the world works. So these name some of the dynamics that we actually want to notice, or as indicators or tohu, when we're looking at changes in the system. And then the third one was just the role of learning. And so most people are familiar with evaluation. Often, sometimes when you say the word evaluation, it doesn't always bring joy in people, the term evaluation. Sometimes it can be really connected to the idea of judging things, or getting to the end of something and saying, did that work or not? And Debbie will talk to us more about this, but the idea of developmental evaluation, or using learning and cycles of learning to actually help us navigate and help us shift towards what's working and understand what's working in the system. And so this integration of learning and building a learning system is really critical for us to build the capacity as a public service to shift how we work. And so we've started to talk about it as building our learning infrastructure within the public service. So how do we cultivate reflective practice? How do we cultivate the capacity to look, to reflect, to say, is this making sense? How does it connect to our bigger picture? How does it connect to what we know about the system? So that integration of learning is really critical. And so there's just a little summary there. This evaluative practice shifts from this idea of being at the end to something that supports us throughout, and it helps to guide our decision making and create rigor around what we're doing. So producing practice-based evidence, documenting what we're learning. And so we can see some more examples of that through the work that Sophia and Debbie will share with us. So those are just some background things. We can come back to them. But what I want to do now is just hand over to Sophia, who will talk to us about her work and how some of these things show up in actual practice. So I'll stop sharing and hand over to you, Sophia. Kia ora.
So I am part of the Tamariki Wellbeing team, and our team is focused on transforming the system of support around parents and whānau, particularly who have children in the first 1,000 days. And we're focused on supporting key system agencies and institutions to figure out what they need to do differently to get better results. And in our team, we're working with 4 different innovation partners. So we've got MSD, Plunkett, Papakura Marae, and our own libraries. And so while we're trying to develop prototypes and to produce outcomes on the ground, we're also trying to influence systems change and at the same time build the capacity of the players inside those system partners to be working in a more whānau-centred way. And so now I'm going to talk to some of the tools and methods that we use to help us hold all of those things and to learn our way forward. So Penny's talked about the different kinds of evidence, and this is an example of some of the evidence that we draw on in our work. So we use longitudinal data from the Growing Up in New Zealand study. We've taken some stuff from neuroscience, particularly from Harvard and the development of children. We use knowledge from the lived experience of families and their strengths and their know-how. We're taking stuff from mātauranga Māori, particularly around traditional parenting practices. We're also using practice-based evidence by when we're out working with families and our system partners, testing and learning in the real world. And then we also we have our tikanga, which holds us and guides the way that we work in the outcomes. And we draw on all of this to help us build our theory of change. But our theory of change helps our teams have a shared reference point for what we're going to be testing and learning about and what works and why. And so it's been developed out of all of these different types of evidence. So in our theory of change, we're focused on 3 levels of outcomes. We've got our whānau outcomes, which is understanding what are the outcomes that we're generating through our design processes and through the work that we're doing with family and what matter to them. We're looking at the changes at the system level. What are we noticing about what conditions are needed for whānau wellbeing, the 6 conditions of systems change that Penny was describing around mindsets, the power balances, changes in policies and resources, and also strategic learning. So that is really about what is it that we're doing that's making the difference? What are we learning about the changes and what outcomes matter? And we're tracking these all the way through, not just at the end. Would you mind jumping in for a sec, Penny?
Yeah, kapai. So you were talking to us about the different things that are tracked across the process of the work together with whānau. So looking at what's going on for whānau on the ground and what their version of that is. So what's a local indicator for whānau, and so for an example here, strong social connections and friendships is a really critical thing that's important for families, that allows them to get the things that they need, being opportunities to step into leadership, opportunities to share knowledge with others. So these are examples of the kinds of things that we've learnt, or that Tamariki Wellbeing team has learnt, that matter to whānau and help them on their journey for accessing the kinds of things that they need to address whatever's going on for them or to grow their well-being, but also the things that start to matter or indicate difference, say, within the systems and services that they're engaging with. What are the shifts that we're seeing there? So the kinds of capacities to share power with whānau. When are we seeing a shift within organisations? So they might start to hand over some of the decision making or develop spaces and policies that are more responsive, to start to prioritise things like manaakitanga, if that's what families have told us is the most important thing for them to experience, and for the use of different forms of evidence. So these are the changes at systems level, are the kind of indications that tell us an organisation is on that way to move to being more responsive to what whānau are saying they need in order to get to where they want to get to. And then the strategic learning outcomes at the top. And I think probably the next slide is about how over time this learning then feeds the theory of change?
So in order for us to track at those 3 levels, understanding what's going on for whānau, what's going on at the systems change, and then what are the strategic learning outcomes, we have built in a reflective practice into our work. And we have both an internal and an external part of that practice. Our internal reflective practice, and it was interesting, Shaq, that you were talking about not having the time or the space to do that reflection. And it's a really critical discipline that we've built into our practice. And it's like, I don't come from a developmental evaluation background at all. And it's meant a completely new way of being for myself and for the team. And we've got to really be disciplined about it. So we have these internal reflections and we do those weekly. And as part of those as part of our reflective practice, we're asking questions around what are we doing and what have we been doing and with who, what's working, what hasn't been working, what have we been learning, and what have we heard, seen, noticed. So that means when we're actually doing the do, we've got to be really cognizant of what's kind of going on around us and always observing and being curious. So we do those weekly reflection sessions. We also do this kind of an external process that we call reality testing. Quite often our internal reflections, they give us some hunches about what we think are potential outcomes. So we might be thinking, we did a design process with a group of mamas over that big lockdown period. And we would have our weekly reflection sessions as a team. And we kept noticing that people kept showing up. They were saying that they were learning lots out of the process, just as part of like random bits of conversation. So we had this sense that there was something about the space that we were creating in a Zoom session that was allowing whānau to keep showing up. And so we felt like we needed to check in what that was. And so we did that by asking someone to have a conversation with those mamas to actually dig down into what are they getting out of the process. So we're checking our hunches through our own internal reflections by doing this external reality testing. Another example was like sometimes you have no idea about the impact of the thing that you've just been doing with people. So we've sent out just survey monkeys to different teams to say, has the thing that we've been doing made a difference in your practice, and genuinely been asking people those questions. And like I said, this process, it requires a real building of that, of your reflective muscle, and it's a real discipline. And it's a real discipline not to get bogged down into the detail, but to kind of lift yourself up to understand what is it that we're learning about what's going on for whānau, what are we learning about what the changes are in the system, what are the changes that we're seeing in the system, and what is it that's actually made the difference, if there have been changes or not, which is that third level of the strategic learning outcomes. And we're also feeding that back into the process of when we're working. So as an example, the whānau outcomes down here, what whānau are telling us is that they want to step into these leadership roles. So what we hear that, so then we build that into our process. So we provide opportunities for whānau to step into those leadership roles. So those reflective practices is allowing us to make changes in the moment, as well as to think more broadly about what that might look like in order to make long-lasting systems change. We do this as like in our individual, we have small project teams that work on stuff together in little groups. So we have these 4 different pieces of work that we're doing. And then at times we come together. So everyone's doing these internal reflections and the reality testing. And at specific points across the year, we come together and synthesize all of that together. So you get this kind of layering of knowledge, which helps to build that kind of rigor in the evidence that you're building and that practice-based evidence. And I have to tell you that that is not the most fun process in the world. It is really challenging, and it's time consuming, and you have to slow down for it. But what you get out of it is generative, and it means that you're actually able to go faster, because you might, in one project, you might hear this thing about people needing to become leaders. You might hear that in one project, and then you're hearing it in another one, and then you're going, okay, if we're hearing it in multiple places, it's a thing, and we should be spending more energy on those things. And what that then does as well is that it helps us to iterate our theory of change. And so this whole process is a constant iteration. But one of, and I think it was you again, Shak, or it might have been Tavis, who talked about those small moments where you see change. It was you, Shak, with the shell in the water. And I think when you're able to, when you've built in this discipline practice of reflection and capturing it, because actually capturing it is like half the battle, you are able to note those small moments of transformation that you're seeing, and then able to kind of build on them. And it, I think it helps, you know, when you're trying to look at the bigness and the hardness of systems change, being able to capture those small moments and knowing that you're moving in that direction towards transformation is pretty magic. And again, I apologize for my earlier mini meltdown before. But kia ora.
Kia ora, Sophia. Ngā mihi, all good. It's pretty intense when you're like staring into the Zoom abyss to like remember everything and stuff. So I really appreciate that. Kia ora. Just want to give everyone a minute to just jot down a couple of things that stood out for you from what Sophia has shared. So just taking 2 minutes to just write down maybe 3 things that kind of stood out from what Sophia shared about the practice that they've been developing. So Baruch can maybe just give us a bit of a song, depending on how long they are, Baruch, and just give everyone a couple minutes just to jot something down from that kōrero. Thank you, Sophia. You can drop it in the chat if you want, but really happy for you just to write it down on a piece of paper too, just so it's your kind of personal record and prompt. Oh, beautiful. Awesome timing. Kia ora. Thanks, Brooke. So let's take a 10-minute break now, just to give ourselves the headspace for coming back for the last part of the session. So it just went 10:46, but 10:55 we'll return here and come back into this conversation, into the notes that you've just made for yourselves, and build on this conversation about learning infrastructure, learning culture. So kia ora again, Sophia. Thank you so much for your kōrero. See everyone soon. Kia ora, welcome back. Okay, so just wanting to pause in this space that Sophia has started to expand on for us, and it will do some more with Debbie around in terms of learning. So coming back to this part of that original foundations wheel or star, where we started, and the different dimensions that are critical to this practice, and just zooming into that learning kind of portion, and just wanting to provide an opportunity for people to think a bit more about how the questions that are in here, which, you know, how are we set up to work as a learning system, and how well are we using data and evidence for learning. So just reflecting back on the way that our personal and organizational practices are kind of enabling this or not at the moment, and the opportunities for creating some spaces around that. And just wanting to introduce a little, it's like the most mini, basic, tiny prototype you could ever kind of do, but it's just a really little fast tool that we use quite a lot, usually in person. So you get nice little yellow cards, but in here we'll have an imaginary yellow card. And it's just a quick little activity that groups can do after they've had a conversation about stuff, but just to think about, what's this telling us about the potential shifts in practice that we could look to cultivate. And so it just says, think about how things are now as is. Now we often do what, and in the future we will. So what could our practice look like? What might be the thing that we start to shift to? And so normally we invite people to draw this, and you can draw it if you like, but you won't be expected to show it to us. But just using this little structure here as a background to your conversation. So just thinking for a minute before we put you into breakouts to have this conversation as a group, because it can be really useful to understand what others are doing. Just have a think about in your world, what might an as is to be look like for you? So in terms of your learning practice, how you use reflection, data, evidence for learning at the moment, maybe the different perspectives, or how the practice allows that kind of learning loop to happen. What is a potential as is to be that you might experiment with in your practice or your team's practice at the moment? So I'm just going to give you a short minute to think about what that might look like, and as is to be. Cool. Wherever you got to is perfect. And just that is a little thought bubble just to take into a conversation with the wider group around, what are teams doing now? What kind of promising practice could you share with each other or learn from each other? And maybe you might come back and add into the chat some potential as is to be's that turned up in your conversation. So we'll put you into small groups now for you to be able to just have this conversation. What are teams doing now around supporting or enabling that learning capacity, using evidence and data for learning? What could you share with each other? So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes or so. Kia ora. Or maybe someone could capture a few things to go in the chat actually around those as is to be's. That might make it easier if you have a scribe. So we'll see you soon. Hi. All right, awesome. So just hopefully someone, well, maybe someone was scribing, maybe they weren't. But if people could just drop some examples of your as is to be or other reflections in the chat, we can kind of see what kinds of shifts were coming up for people, or potential things that could be introduced or focused on in your organizations. Get a few more groups dropping in some reflections, that'll be awesome. But just in the background, people talking about wanting to explore some of these things with the team, and we had some examples of how people are doing that. And the module C prompt cards, which some of you will have in digital form and some of you have in physical form, but we'll make sure that all of you get in physical form, can be a way just to help go deeper with the team and think about learning practice. And so there's a particular set in there that just help support conversations around how that's happening in practice. So, oh great, having some more reflections in there from the group. Check that out. What I'm going to do now though is just as a way to not just set us up for tomorrow, but Debbie's going to just introduce us to some of her world, her work, her kōrero, as a kind of opening and reflection piece to close off our session today. And then we get to connect back into this conversation tomorrow morning with her again, as we hear from her around the kind of conditions that are really important for working together, and also processes that she's supported and been involved in around the development of collective criteria and ideas of success and things like that. So for this last little piece of the session today, we're just inviting Debbie to share in any reflections she's had on today's session, but also just learn us a little bit into her world and her mahi. So I'll hand over. Thank you so much, Debbie, for joining us. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. And I will stop screen sharing and hand over to you, Ihua.
Kia ora, Penny. Thank you for that. I just had someone turn up at my door, so I had to tell them to go away. Things happen in this sort of world that we do this mahi in now. So I see that the title of my kōrero is Kaupapa Māori Ways of Learning and Being. I feel a little bit tentative about that, but it is something that I have been doing within my study on my thesis, PhD thesis. But it's as I think the first thing I think for me to share with you all would be actually as a Māori and Pākehā from both worlds, growing up with a Māori dad and a Pākehā mum. My reflection on that is that the worlds are very different, and I think the first thing that we need to do is we acknowledge our mahi out there with Māori communities, as Māori or as Pākehā, is that we are coming from different worldviews, and what are those worldviews? So just acknowledging that, so, you know, on my Pākehā side, there's definitely different kōrero that happens to the family on my Māori side. And sometimes those worlds don't even meet. Like there's often, I've been to family reunions on my Pākehā side, and you can count the Māori people in that family reunion, you know what I mean? But then there's other whānau that have mixed. So it's kind of, it's understanding that as Māori, there is a different worldview than Pākehā worldviews, and we should acknowledge that and learn more about that, whether it's our own worldviews or whether we need to learn more about Māori worldviews or iwi worldviews or whatever. So again, there's different whakaaro in our iwi from all our different iwi. We have different whakaaro, and we come from different places and spaces, really. So just acknowledging that in our mahi. So as a developmental evaluator, I work with a number of colleagues that basically we, just as Sophia said, is learning as we go, or supporting learning with the teams that we're working with. And we take a number of different roles. They could just be, so Sophia really explained DE quite well, because it's really putting in place structures that you can learn as a team as you go. But sometimes as evaluators, we can come in and support that a little with facilitation, with helping to set up evaluation design for that sort of process, with being a critical friend or constructive friend. So asking some hard questions. Sometimes we don't want to ask ourselves those questions. And supporting systems change and thinking about, you know, what is it that we need to be thinking about? Supporting evaluative thinking and how we might kind of identify evaluative criteria for collecting, and how we might do that collaboratively. So I can talk a little bit more about some examples tomorrow around how we've done that. From a kaupapa Māori perspective, as kaupapa Māori evaluators, the main thing is to establish relationships. So we're working with iwi Māori communities that are often being contracted or partnered with from government agencies. More so partnering in this, you know, recent age and stage. And so some of the questions are around what is partnering and how do we partner with communities, with iwi, and a DE approach would actually pay attention to how those relationships are going. So what are the questions we're asking, or we need to ask of ourselves as a team, and of relationships. Going into iwi Māori communities, we just take the stance of te tiro whakarongo kōrero. So first look and listen, and understand the context, understand who is involved, and build the relationship with the people. And often we're asking them to drive the process. So what is it that they want to know? What is it that they want to evidence? What do they want to evaluate? And some people struggle with that because, you know, it's all new. It's sometimes hard to think about what it is. It's quite complex. We're working in complex spaces, especially when it's about partnering. It involves really complex programs. It's just helping to guide that thinking and support that. What is it that we do track or evidence going forward? So what else did I want to share? We've just written a little excerpt in a book that just came out today called, it's the Developmental Evaluation Exemplar or something like that. It was launched this morning at 5 a.m. And in that there's a little kōrero around kaupapa Māori DE, which we liken to wayfinding, and you guys have talked about waka. So in wayfinding and in our waka journeys, we can use that as a metaphor for understanding the whole, what is happening around us and how we might direct our path. And I think that it's a really cool metaphor to use for evaluation, but also for your mahi, working with others. So in the waka, we're understanding what are the signs, what are the birds telling us, what are the tides, what are the winds, and all that to shape our direction. And part of that, as Māori, I think, is really our wairua. We bring our wairua to the kaupapa and to the context so that we can sense and understand. So a lot of what we do as evaluators is also, you know, that debriefing, that understanding of what's going on, what actually is going on here, and that sensing, what are we hearing, what are we observing, what are we learning. So it's a great metaphor to use, and you've used it throughout this course. It's something that is very reflective of us as kaupapa Māori evaluators. I noticed that in the first Slido that you did, that there was quite a lot of heaviness amongst some of you, and it just pointed out to me that this mahi is really hard. And, you know, as evaluators or as anyone, we want to support this work and we want this work to really flourish. So one of the things that it has come out as well is the pace of things. We see it all the time where the pace of government is just so fast and you just got to get it done and tick those boxes. What we are seeing is that within that pace, you can create some space somehow for slowing down a little, and that reflection or DE process could help that. An example we're doing right now is a reflective weekly process with the team in the Waikato, where we just check in with them and reflect. So if you need someone to actually dial up or dial in and take a process, that might be an easier way for doing reflection. And it has supported them because it's a hard road that they're doing. They're within the government agency, and it's a struggle on kind of local site. So yeah, that's just one way that we can help. I think just to finish, I would just like to mihi to our two tāne that shared Tavis and Shaq around the kōrero that you gave, which I think brings a real reality as Māori to the mahi, and it reflected on the accountabilities of us as Māori within either government or NGOs or whatever. And as researchers, as evaluators, we also feel that accountability to our communities. We have that dual accountability, is what Penny called it. And just to acknowledge that as Māori, that is a place that we have to work in. And the heaviness, the whakaaro that you shared is just really on point around understanding intergenerational trauma and how we might unweave that. That's just one aspect of it. For example, understanding our people and where they're coming from and what is needed to lift them up. So I just want to acknowledge that kōrero, and just, I guess we can talk more about things tomorrow, but how do we, as if we are non-Māori, how would we support that kōrero, or how would we support our Māori colleagues that have that dual accountability in this sort of mahi? I'm not sure if I covered what I was supposed to, but that's just a little dip into what we do as developmental evaluators from a kaupapa Māori perspective. But yeah, looking forward to catching up with you all tomorrow as well. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Debbie. You covered that. What you covered was the perfect thing to cover. So kia ora, thank you very much. Rather than kind of layer a whole lot more stuff on that kōrero, I'll just say if you have questions that you'd really like, if we can, to explore a bit tomorrow, please drop them in the chat. So if there's a particular question, if it's not tomorrow, then maybe it's in the future. So just drop that in. That's come out from today. Just to say there's a few links and references, including the book that Debbie mentioned, that we'll add into the slides and share with you. But just to really actually leave us with the kōrero that Debbie has just shared there, and to say that we'll continue to explore that together tomorrow morning in our session together. So thank you so much. Have a beautiful day today, as much as you can, depending on whatever's going on in your world, and really look forward to seeing everyone's faces again tomorrow. Thank you again to everyone that shared, and to our learning partners for this time together. Kia ora, and we'll close for us.